Hi, I'm Adrian, and I'm going to present the article Working Memory Training, Improving Intelligence by Jaus and Jaus from 2012. They started out with two research questions, in particular, can working memory training of badly subcomponents improve fluid intelligence outcomes? And in particular, does training of the short-term storage and the executive control functioning lead to better guidance of attention, which results in higher fluid intelligence? And second, can we capture those effects of working memory training on brain activity using EEG and NIRS imaging techniques, which I will expand on later on? They had three kinds of hypotheses. The first was that working memory training would enhance fluid intelligence scores on several DV scales as compared to an active control group, which received emotional intelligence training. The second hypothesis was that an increase in brain activity would occur in frontal and parietal lobes only in the experimental group. And the tertiary hypothesis was that theta band synchronization and lower alpha band desynchronization was being observed in EEG and NIRS imaging. The subjects they used for the study were 26 female and 4 male psychology students, which were enrolled in an educational psychology class. The experimental and control groups were equalized after IQ and gender, which means there were an equal amount of female and male participants in each group. And as you can see, the IQs were closely matched by the mean. However, one female subject in the experimental condition had no post-test taken, as she did not comply with the instructions, which brings down the number of participants in the experimental condition to 14, whereas the control condition remained at 15 people. They used several measures of fluid intelligence during the pre- and post-test. The first was a modified Raven's progressive matrices task, which is a well-researched measure of nonverbal fluid intelligence, which is independent of language skills, which is an improvement above other measures of intelligence. They delivered 25 easy and 25 difficult excerpts of the test in order to exclude a confound of difficulty, which was observed in previous studies. The second DV measure they looked at was a verbal analogy task, where they presented 25 analogies in the mother tongue Slovenian to the participants. It was along the lines of fish, water, bird, question mark, and they had the choices between air, branch, shore, or wave. For the third DV measure, they used a spatial rotation task similar to the one that we looked at in class, which is the paper folding and cutting PF&C from the Stanford Binet test. They also presented 25 items for this one, and it was supposed to measure visual spatial reasoning, as you can see here on the right. And the last measure that they used to assess fluid intelligence was the digited span subtest of the WAISR, which measured working memory relating effects to maintenance and to the episodic buffer. Concerning the trials, they separated them into a working memory training group and a control group. The experimental group received 5 different audiovisual tasks, which related to working memory storage, attentional control, and the central executive. The first task was finding pairs within matrices, which were presented briefly after each other. So they had to look at the matrix, remembered certain pairs on this matrix, and afterwards were tested on some certain pairs on this matrix. They varied in the amount of pairs which were presented simultaneously, and also in the similarity of the items, which could make it less or more difficult. The second task they used was a working memory maintenance task, which was devised by Krohn et al. In 2006. And the third task was a n-back task. So was the last or the stimulus before that, or the stimulus 3 stimuli back the same stimulus as the present stimulus? This one is important because we'll talk about it later on. It has a bunch of other research, which is quite interesting. The fourth task was just a classical memory game, which was played within a group in order to increase stimulation even further. And the last task was a sentence construction game, where each participant added one word, and every participant had to repeat this list of words that the participant answered before him, which was supposed to get at the verbal part of working memory. In the control group, they received communication and social skills training, which was based on a paper by Gordon from 1974, which looked at communication skills, active and passive listening, etc., with some degree of interaction between participants and the stimulus presentation. And they also received some theoretical lessons with tasks to do at home, as we'll see now. So in the bottom right here, you can see in the control group, they had the same time frame and number of sessions, which was 1 hour a week, plus 45 minutes of applications, which were held inside of the lab. And then in addition to that, they had 9 hours of a video report to do as home assignments, and they received an average of 30 hours of training. The experimental group also received an average of 30 hours of training. They started with one of the single player tasks from the list from before, and then they altered the group on a single task, etc., for about 15 to 20 minutes per task. They had 12 weeks of 75 to 100 minutes per session, plus 2 times 30 minutes per week of the single player tasks, which amounted to an average of 30 hours as well. The DV measures were actually assessed in a certain order each time, so for test and retest later after training. So the WAISR was separately measured according to the manual, as you have to adhere to the standards first. Once they got into the lab, they were told to relax for 5 minutes, and they got baseline EEG and NIRS taken. After that, they solved the Raven progressive matrices, then the verbal analogies, then the paper folding in a fixed order, all the time while the EEG and NIRS measures were recorded, so that actually constituted the baseline. And the retest was held after 6 months after the initial testing, 10 days after the stop of the training to account for the menstrual cycle of the overwhelmingly female population. And after they started with the single player task and the altering group task, etc., as I went over before. Now I want to briefly mention the NIRS near-infrared spectroscopy, which was used in the study. It's a non-invasive optical imaging technique which detects changes in blood flow by the use of low wavelength lights. I added a link to the University of Pittsburgh, which actually has quite an interesting article about this. Very interesting, and they had certain results that we'll look over just in a second. Before that, let's look at the behavioral results here. So they used a general linear model for differences, and they found only an interaction effect between treatment group and the test-retest condition, in which they basically found the participants in the working memory training group performed significantly better after training on those several DV measures that we went over. There was no improvement for the control group that they could measure, as you can see on this graph on the right as well. These effects were especially pronounced on the Raven's progressive matrices test and the digit span test, and they were less pronounced on the paper folding test, and there was no effect on the verbal analogies, which kind of plays on the role of fluid intelligence in the Raven matrices. And so it seems like we're doing the right thing with this experiment. There was no difference between easy and difficulty tasks, so there's no indication for an effect of difficulty, which might have acted as a confound. The results of the EEG increased significantly in the experimental group. So there was a higher theta synchronization in the parietal occipital lobe and the frontal and right temporal areas, which is about to be expected given the visual and working memory tasks that they have, which falls in line with previous research. They also found high activity in the frontal area of lower 1 alpha waves, lower 2 alpha parietal to central areas, in right hemispheric parietal upper alpha bands. Between 5,000 and 6,000 megaseconds, it actually expanded to both hemispheres, which is quite interesting, as this also tapped into the NIRS findings. So generally, there is actually a difference in oxyhemoglobin, which is oxygenated blood flow across the hemispheres in the frontal brain area, and generally lower levels are found in the left hemisphere. This is mirrored by the EEG results that I just presented, and that was what has been found in the control group. The interesting part, and that's where the EEG results tie in, is that the experimental group almost actually had equal levels across both hemispheres, which means that there is an increase of supply of oxygenated blood to the left hemisphere, which is where problem-solving abilities are being found as well. The conclusions that they've drawn were first that working memory training actually can improve performance on transferable fluid intelligence measures, and they qualify that particular findings might relate to the female participants more. A small sample limits the generalizability of these results, and a ceiling effect has been observed on the available analyses where 69% were solved on the pretest already. Second of all, yes, there are detectable differences in the brain, and the lower 1 alpha findings in the occipital point towards better filtering of important versus unimportant information. So this actually ties back to another interesting finding that I'll talk about in a second. NIRS and EEG results jointly point towards a change in retention and processing capacity of the central executive, which is what we want to see. This can be compared to Yegi et al.'s paper, which see similar results when they only use the N-back task that we talked about earlier. They also look at the effects on fluid intelligence, and they also use a mix of auditory and visual stimuli. They do, however, miss an active control group, which slightly reduces the internal validity of the results. But as they look at the same dependent variable, like the progressive Raven matrices and also the digit span, those are comparable, and they point towards the same conclusion that working memory training is effective given that you use the right tools. We can connect this to the class, as the paper shows that relying on Baddeley's model of working memory can produce tangible results when used for deriving training measures. And we talked about the importance of the central executive and the episodic buffer for performance on demanding tasks in class. Also, as in class, the Bouncer model expanded upon this and stated that the more efficient working memory performance was actually accompanied by a better filtering out of unimportant information, which the further support was given by this paper in the form of EEG and NIRS results. In class, we also talked about the role of the prefrontal cortex and the parietal temporal lobe in selective attention, which again was confirmed by EEG activity. Connection to everyday life. What I take from this is that it seems to pay off to actually do some mental training, given that you use the right tasks. So the N-back task seems to be one that might be a candidate for this. This could also be observed in a meta-analysis that was recently published by O et al., which actually found that the N-back task seems to be pretty effective overall in about 50 to 60 studies. However, you should still be careful with generalizations, and you should think about male populations, about population which lay outside of the undergrad pool that we usually draw from, and also outside of the lab, because I mean those are very artificial situations that might not be very well replicated elsewise. Thank you very much.